A little review. Last week, what reason did Jesus give for why his disciples did not fast like John's disciples did? He was still with them. How did he describe that? What did he say? What did he call himself? How did he refer to himself? Referred to himself as the bridegroom. Said the attendants of the bridegroom don't fast while the bridegroom's with them. So in connection with that, when did Jesus say his disciples would fast? When the bridegroom was taken away. What was he alluding to? I bet you know. He talked about this with them several times, that he would be arrested, tried, crucified, buried, raised the third day. How would you express the point Jesus made using the parables about the patched cloth and wineskins? We didn't talk a whole lot about that, but we did talk about it. And surely if you have read that, you've thought about it, you've pondered over it. What was the point? What do you think he's trying to say when he says, don't patch an old garment with a piece of new cloth and don't put new wine in old wineskins? What's that? Out with the old, in with the new. In other words, there's a change coming. And they should have been aware of that, at least from the standpoint of the prophets. Jeremiah, especially, chapter 31, said, days are coming when God's going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel. Not like the old one that your fathers broke, but going to write this one on your hearts. And so they knew there was a new covenant coming. They knew the Messiah was coming, going to make some major changes. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And you don't mix, you don't add the old to the new. This is another passage where he's talking about it. It may not be so blatant, but other passages talk about the fact that the old covenant was intended to pass away. It wasn't meant to be forever. How did Paul refer to it when he wrote to the churches of Galatia? The old law was a schoolmaster, a tutor, to do what? To bring us to Christ. And now that Christ has come, we're no longer under a schoolmaster. So there's an Old Testament, we call it, an old covenant, and there is a new covenant, a new testament bought with the blood of Christ. And once you're in the new, you don't need, the old one's gone. That's you can't practice it. Why can't you practice the old covenant anymore? You don't have the priesthood. You don't have a priesthood, you can't offer sacrifices. You can't offer sacrifices, you don't have any forgiveness. And there's a reason for that. There's only one sacrifice, and that's Jesus. So that's wrapped up in these two parables. What was Jesus teaching through the grain and the man's withered hand? What grain? Okay, they were going through the wheat field. When? When were they going through the wheat field? Sabbath day, on Saturday. And the law said you can't do any work on Saturday. And so he was being confronted about that. And what did he say? In this context, there are other contexts where he talks about the Sabbath and things you do on the Sabbath. What are some of the things he mentioned you do on the Sabbath that normal people do and don't even think about? Number one, you pull an animal out of the pit, a sheep or a goat or an ox. And what else do you do? Not just pull it out of the pit. What do you do before you have to worry about it being in a pit? Don't you lead it to water? You do these things. How about, this one's interesting. What if the 8th day of your child's new life falls on a Sabbath? Jesus said that. Even circumcision takes place on the Sabbath, if that's the day. That's other places, but here he says this. And by the way, he refers to himself in a very interesting way. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So what's he teaching? Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, but is there anything else there? One of the reasons I don't mind slogging through, I don't really think of it as slogging through. I'm just talking about the fact we're not moving real fast, are we? But it's okay if as we're moving, we're thinking about Jesus, and the wheels are turning, how are we still supposed to apply what he says? I don't know if you've noticed it, but as you read the Bible, you'll read a section, and there's not a little post section that says, now that you've read this, here's the points that you needed to have learned, and here are the ways you apply that. There's nothing like that there. It's as if God expects us to be smart enough to do that ourselves. And so that's what we do. We read these things, and we try to figure out, all right, we're studying Luke's gospel on Wednesday night. How's that going to change the way we live on Thursday? How's that going to impact the way I conduct myself on Thursday? How's that going to change the way I interact with my family on Thursday? How's this going to change my attitude towards life and towards getting up to go to work and towards dealing with people who are obnoxious and irritants? I know you don't have any people like that in your life, but for those people who do, who live somewhere else, this is what this is all about. Jesus came to give us life and to give it more abundantly and to give it with an eternal quality. And so I'm hoping all these things make a difference as we think these things through. Here's something I'm thinking about with regard to the grain, and him saying the Son of Man's Lord of the Sabbath. And yeah, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but what do you do with that guy's hand? And really, how much work was involved? He said, stretch out your hand. Ooh, a lot of work there. And the man's hand was healed. And instead of celebrating, people were angered to the point of trying to find a way to destroy Jesus. I'm just thinking there's a law, but Jesus is telling us, all right, there are exceptions to the law, because the law was not given to punish people. The law was given to bring us towards God. And don't become so rigid. What is it Solomon said? Don't become so righteous, over righteous, that you destroy yourself. Isn't that an interesting turn of phrase? Don, you had something?
You said how much work was involved. Sometimes I think, we think when Jesus healed somebody, it didn't require anything of him. But it did say in one place, it was either Jesus or one of the apostles, it says they felt the power I think it was Jesus when he spoke, they felt the power coming from him. And I don't want to give any credence to something that's beyond the scriptures, but in the movie, the Jesus movie, it looked like he was pretty tired after healing a bunch of people.
Well, it said that earlier.
It could have been that it was tiring for him to heal. So maybe physically on him, it was something that came from him when he healed somebody. I don't know, but it doesn't say.
Right. That was when he was in the big crowd of people.
Sometimes I think we want to think of this magical thing. Oh, it's nothing for him. He just, it was all right.
Yeah. He was in a crowd, and the woman came forward and touched his garment, and he knew the power went from him.
Point was, it might have been some work, so to speak.
Okay. Now, what's the whole point of honoring the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath? Was it just that nobody works? Or was there a recognition of something else greater? Okay, you're going to have to talk louder. Oh, you're on. I'll put this here to you.
Day after creation.
Yes, he rested on the seventh day after creation. So he said, all right, you're going to keep the Sabbath day and make it holy, and don't do any servile work. The stuff that had to be done, they knew was done. You have to lead your ox to water. You got to take care of that on the Sabbath day. If they fall in a ditch, you got to pull them out on the Sabbath day. Young man needs to be circumcised. We'll circumcise him on the Sabbath day. Those are things that were the exceptions to the rule, and Jesus is pointing these things out. He also gave the example of David when he was fleeing from Saul. He went into the tabernacle and he ate the holy bread that wasn't supposed to be eaten like that, but this was an exceptional situation. And so Jesus referenced that, and he says, so why would you condemn us for rolling grain in our hands on the Sabbath day? In other words, think about this. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and body. What's the second one? of your neighbor as yourself. And I believe God would tell us, don't use my commands to oppress one another. Does that sound disrespectful towards anything God has taught? I hope not. But that seems to be what Jesus is saying here. Bobby.
One other thing too is God realized that men's greed would have them working 7 days a week, 24 hours. And he said, this way I know you'll rest. I'll make you rest.
Right. Have you ever said to yourself recently, now I understand why God said not to work one day out of the week? Because we work during the week, and then when the weekend comes, oh, we're going to have fun on the weekend, and then you do things on the weekend that are harder on you than the work you do through the week. And by the time Monday comes around, you need a vacation from your vacation. Jamie.
No, I haven't necessarily said that recently, but I have said, even God said, let the donkey rest.
Right. Let him rest. All right. I think it's time to do some reading. Chapter 6, we're just going to read this section first, talk about it a little bit, and then move on from there. Move on from there, right? Who would like to read that? Chapter 6, 12 to 19. Got a volunteer? All right, Janie.
In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them, and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples, and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him, and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all.
Excellent, thank you. So, why do you suppose the Holy Spirit inspired Luke to make sure to tell us Jesus spent the whole night in prayer? You could have said Jesus went off to pray, and the next day he did this. Does it in any way make you feel a little bit convicted when you read that Jesus spent a night in prayer? When is the last time you spent a night in prayer? And I'm not making any presumptions, but I just don't think that's something we do very often. Spend an entire night in prayer. Now, why would Jesus need to spend a night in prayer? He's Jesus. He's the Son of God. He has the quality of divinity. If the Spirit of God is with anyone, it's with him, and yet he spends a night in prayer. And what's he do the next day? Chose the 12. What do you think he was praying about? That's speculation. I'm asking for speculation. But you look at the context and you think, well, I don't know. But I bet it was about those guys, one way or another. I got 3 hands up. Will and Carrie.
I started the night in prayer, then I woke up.
Yeah. That's a good way to fall asleep, though. Is there a better way to fall asleep than praying? Gary?
I think it's reasonable to assume. I guess I don't think of it as speculation, but since, in context, the verses are right next to each other, it's reasonable to assume that he had a very big decision the next day, or a very big, whether it was a decision he was going to make, or if he'd already made it and he was praying about that, or, whatever it was, there was a very big undertaking the very next day. These are his 12 disciples. These are the men he was going to live his life with for the next few years, and then, charged to spread the gospel after that. So I had put a note in here from reading this previously. It's just a good example. to us. You know, do you want to act like Jesus? Well, you got to find, you know, how do you act like Jesus? Well, you just read how he acted. Well, one thing he did was he prayed before a big decision. So,
And we make decisions that for us are big.
a lot, and we don't always make praying about them diligently a priority. So I think it's a good example.
When I read this, I wonder, you know, Peter said, cast all your anxiety on the Lord. Did Jesus have any anxiety? Is it wrong to think that the Son of God might have been kind of worried about some of these things? He was in the garden, and what did he pray in the garden? As he sweat drops, as it were, like blood. Prayed, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass. And I'm thinking, why would he pray that? That's the whole point of him coming. That's what Peter says. I know we're studying Luke. But Peter said, it was the Spirit of Christ and the prophets who foretold of the suffering that he would go through. That's what the Apostle Peter says, first chapter of his first letter. So, you ever wonder if he did that so that he was allowing us to see his humanity and the struggle? What's the one thing he gave us as a memorial? The Lord's Supper. What do we remember at the Lord's Supper? The death. The death. Only the death is referenced with regard to the Lord's Supper. Not the resurrection. We love the resurrection. But that's not what the Lord's Supper is about. One thing, the death, the sacrifice, the offering up, the suffering, the difficulty, the pain, the anguish, whatever it meant to bear the sin of the world, I have no clue. But that's the one thing we're given to remember. And he prayed that way in the garden, and now he's praying all night. And just like you're pointing out, the spreading of the gospel to the whole world and for the rest of time is going to rest on the backs of these guys, these 12 men. I don't know if Jesus had any doubts. I don't think this was a spur-of-the-moment thing. Oh, let's see, who am I going to get? I don't know. But only one, as far as we know, dropped out, and that was foretold as well. Don and then Kim.
Jesus' power as a human being was limited into that, what the Father allowed him to do and when he told him to do it, basically. Just like the apostles, they couldn't just, they had gifts of healing, but they couldn't just say, well, I'm going to heal this guy. They could only heal when God let them heal. When the Father gave them. They couldn't heal themselves when they were sick. They couldn't heal their friends when they were sick in certain situations. It seems like when God moved them to heal people, then that's when they could heal people. And it seems to me it would be the same with Jesus on earth. And he knew his limitations. He needed to call on the Father for everything. So he needed to call on him to be sure. Is this I'm sure he had in mind who he wanted to choose, but he's like, I want to be sure. I mean, that said, I think his faith was so strong that he could pray all night. Mm-hmm. I've had things that I was really deep on my heart. I mean, really heavy on my heart. And I still couldn't pray all night.
Right.
Not sure I wanted to.
You might do like Will. You're praying.
I'm not sure I care that much
for an hour or two.
or me, or even me. But anyway, it just seems that his faith allowed. Sometimes we think of it as a law. Well, we're not very good if we don't pray all night. Well, it's really just a measure of our faith. And I'm not saying we're not going to go to heaven. I'm just saying it's just a measure of our faith on how much we truly understand how we need for God, and maybe even what he will provide, and so.
Well, by the way, these guys Jesus was praying over all night, later on when he's in the garden, sweating drops of blood, what are those guys doing? They're sleeping. It's like, okay, there's hope for me. I might make it, if that's what he's got. By the way, do you remember, there used to be a series about Hercules, and I can't remember the actor's name who played Hercules, but yeah, that's who it is, Kevin Sorbo. He did a great job. It was an interesting series to watch, but I remember one scene in particular it was freezing cold and the wind was blowing, the snow was falling, and he's walking around in a vest, just hanging out, and everybody else is freezing, wrapped up in furs, and he said, "Aren't you cold?" "Oh, I'm a God." And I thought, that wasn't Jesus. When it got cold, he got cold. When he didn't have enough food, he was hungry. He got thirsty. He was a man in the flesh, just like you and me, and he understood what it was to be in the flesh. And I'm so thankful for that. Kim?
Ramblings in my mind mostly, but Jesus did a lot of things for our example.
Taxes, for one. I mean, what was it that he did not already own? I mean, he's a creator, but he did that. He was baptized, right? Did he have any sin to be forgiven of? No. I mean, he did a lot of things for our example, and I think, I agree with Carrie that just the context and the way it is, yeah, there's a big decision. He prayed all night, but being 100% God, he had to have known from the foundation of the world who these 12 men would be.
Right.
So you bring up an interesting question. What did he tell them?
Just a matter of course. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'll get up in the morning. I'll call those guys. No, the whole night in prayer. Wow, there's something going on there. Kirk?
Kind of like, again, random thoughts by me, but in Matthew 17, talking about Jesus himself needing to pray and understanding the importance of prayer. In Matthew 17, when he cast out the demon and his apostles hadn't been able to, he told them this kind only comes out by prayer and fasting, emphasizing that even he needed to, that prayer was important even for him.
And this bears that out. All night. All night. All right. So he's chosen the apostles. Then it says he comes down, verse 17, stood in a level place, large crowd of people, and what did he do? They came to hear him, but they were also being healed of their diseases. Those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. All the people were trying to touch him. Power was coming from him and healing them all. Now remember, great crowds, great crowds, great crowds. Just before Jesus was arrested and crucified, there was this thing called the triumphal entry. What were people doing during the triumphal entry? They were cutting down palm fronds and laying them in the road, putting their clothes in the road. They were crying out. They were saying a word that got the Jewish leaders upset because it meant this is the guy. And they were afraid this was going to excite the Romans. Anyway, a couple days later, they're crying out for his blood. I'm not saying it's the same people, but this is how quickly things can change in the world. Change that way with Christ. People are coming in throngs to be healed by him. Where were all those people when the throngs were crying out for his blood, even saying, his blood be on us and our children? Man, and that's written down. So things can change. I got a sermon in mind I want to preach someday talking about who your peers are. If we are paying attention to the peer pressure in this world or are grateful for the peer pressure of the other world, the world of Jesus Christ and the faithful who've gone on. And you can read Hebrews 12 about that and the great crowd of witnesses. Anyway, where are we here? Oh, we're going to go to chapter 7 and say, why are we skipping all that? Well, we're about to get into what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to make the assumption that most of you are familiar with the things that are taught in the Sermon on the Mount. There are a few things that Luke adds, because I don't think this sermon is exactly the same sermon that Matthew records. Because 3 years, Jesus was going around the countryside preaching and teaching. I think there were probably the same messages in a lot of different places, and maybe spoken a little bit differently. Because you can't hardly preach the same sermon twice, and one way or another it's going to be a little bit different. But there are some things in the Sermon on the Mount that, as Luke records it, that aren't in Matthew's, and that's not a contradiction. That's just saying here's some things that Matthew didn't record that might not have been in the one he heard. So, anyway, we're going to move on. We're going to start in chapter 7, 1 through 10. Who wants to read? All right, Becca, 1 through 10, and then we'll pick up with 11 through 17, and that'll be enough for right now. Who wants 11 through 17? Anybody? All right, Will. Keep it in the family.
When he had completed all his teaching and the hearing of the people, he went.
Capernium.
When he had completed all his teaching and the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. Now a centurion's slave was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to asking him to come and save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they strongly urged him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue." Now Jesus started on his way with them, but already, when he was not yet far from the house, the centurion sent for him, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to enter under my roof. For that reason, I do not consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant shall be healed. For I also am a man, placed under authority, with soldiers under myself. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health.
Soon afterward, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now, as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not go on weeping." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. He said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has appeared among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread throughout Judea and in all the surrounding regions.
Right, very good. So where'd he go back to? But Capernaum. What's significant about Capernaum? He's kind of making that his base. He grew up in Nazareth. What happened in Nazareth when he read from Isaiah in the synagogue? Or after he read from Isaiah in the synagogue? They tried to kill him. That's what happened in Nazareth, the town where he grew up. So he goes to Capernaum, and he's received there. Who else lives in Capernaum? Peter, Andrew, James, John. Because Capernaum was right on the Sea of Galilee, and that's where they worked as fishermen. So, it says a centurion's slave. Who was what? He was highly regarded by the centurion. That's one thing, but then you get down to verse 3, and what does that show you about the centurion? He was highly regarded by the Jews of Capernaum. Isn't that interesting? Didn't normally happen. Verse 4 says, when they came to Jesus, these Jewish people, they earnestly implored him, saying, he's worthy for you to grant this to them. Now, what does that tell you about these guys? Couple of things. Number one, they're open to having a relationship even with a guy who's a Roman centurion. That was not a common circumstance. They were so open to this relationship, and they had become so, what's the word? They had so much affection for him that they're saying, let's go to Jesus. What does that tell you? Except that they also have faith in Jesus that he can do this. If they didn't, they would say, why would we go to Jesus? He can't do anything about this. Your slave is sick, and that's just all there is to. No. They said, let's go to Jesus, and let's, what's the word? Let's implore him to do something for this Roman centurion that we are not able to do. That's, to me, that's outstanding. You just don't see that much among the Jews at this point in time. And they even give evidence. He's worthy for you to grant this to him, they say in verse 4. Then in verse 5, they say, he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue. You remember a couple of weeks back, I showed you pictures of the synagogue in Capernium? That's the synagogue that this guy built. So they're coming to Jesus on this man's behalf and asking blessings for him. So Jesus starts on his way, and what happens? The centurion sends some people, and what do they say? He says he's not worthy for you to come into his house. That is not typical of a Roman centurion. To say to anyone who's Jewish, I'm a Roman centurion, but I'm unworthy for you to come into my house. It's usually the other way around. I have so much regard for this guy and for these people because their minds are open to things that are true. And they're seeing what's happening, and it's making an impact in them, exactly the kind of impact that God and Jesus, his Son, and the Holy Spirit intend for this to have. And so I read this, and I think, all right, what kind of impact does God want it to have on me? Well, yeah, because that's really what this is all about. As I'm reading this is for me. This is for you. These people are changed. I need to be changed. And this is evidence that the change is good. Because everything we're reading about gives us a sense of respect and regard for these people. Verse 7, the centurion, his message to Jesus through his friends is, I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And then he says why he believes that's true. I got servants, and I know they come here and they go there. But wait a minute, what about this guy's servants? What about the centurion's servants? Tell me about them. They're physical people who have no power to do anything about sickness. But what is he saying about Jesus' servants and Jesus' power and Jesus' authority? As a Roman centurion, he's saying, I know you have the means. How much theology do you think this guy understood? It's not about the theology we understand. It's about the theology we believe. I don't know if that even makes sense. But what this guy believed surpassed anything you could write in a book. He saw who Jesus was, and he understood the power, and he knew he needed that power, and he humbled himself to ask, but to ask from a distance. This is like when we get to chapter 18, and Jesus is talking about those two guys that go up to the temple to pray, and the one guy won't even look up. He looks down, he hits himself in the chest, he says, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's this guy. This is the same spirit in this man. And he is a Roman centurion. And he's already expressed faith by providing for these people their synagogue. And whatever he's doing it in such a way that he's got these guys on his side and they're coming to Jesus on his behalf and imploring Jesus to do something. And I see so much faith here in the people, but especially in this guy. And Jesus says, wow, I haven't found such great faith in Israel. Now, is that like the comment that he made in Nazareth? What did he say in Nazareth that really got him in trouble? He said, back in the days of Elijah, there was a widow woman who was given a blessing of having oil and meal that never failed. But she was a Gentile. Didn't happen to any Jews. And in the days of Elisha, who followed Elijah, there was a leper who was healed of his leprosy, but he was a Gentile. Didn't happen to any Jews. And when they heard that, they got so enraged, that's when they tried to kill him in Nazareth. But here he's in Capernium, and he says, I've never seen faith in Israel like this Roman centurion's got. And instead of rising up in anger against Jesus, these people are imploring him to do the very thing for him that he needs. This is, I hate to say it's amazing, because amazing is just so overused these days. But this is amazing. You stop and think about it.
Marty,
Yes.
a lot of the centurions back there had,
I'm sorry?
back there in those days, it talks about a lot of the centurions who had faith.
Yes. The one standing there at the cross when he saw everything that happened. He said,
Ones that were good Paul too.
right. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. So, yeah, just like the guy said, he was right. That's how Jesus did it. Any observations and commentary? Oh, Jamie.
It kind of reminds me of today, those who have grown up in faith and those who come to it later in life. For us who have been in the Church of Christ or some other denomination and have grown up being Christian, we don't always see the magnitude of the blessings and the gift of that, because it's always been there, we've always seen it. And you've got somebody who's outside of that, and it being Rome, and they've got a pantheon, there's a lot of open-mindedness about what gods can do, but then seeing people that were directly affected by somebody and having that great faith in this one, like, wow, I mean, there's actually something going on, and they see it and they know it, whereas if you've always been in it, it's like, yeah, that's just a normal day for Jesus, good job, you know? And
Yeah.
that sometimes it just doesn't give that enormous impression of how deep that is, because, you know, it's just everyday part of life.
And it's true of us. We're supposed to make a habit of assembling with the saints. That's what the writer of Hebrews said. Don't forsake the assembling of the saints. It's a habit that we ought to be into all the time. But it can be such a habit that we don't really think about it and appreciate it for what it is. And before long, yeah, I got to go to church again. And yeah, I got to sing these songs and pray these prayers. And we lose sight of the fact that when we come together, we're in the presence of the guy who spoke the universe into existence. And we lose sight of how desperately we need him, because without God, our only end is suffering. We lose sight of the spiritual realm, and it's not like the spiritual realm's way up there in heaven. I think the way the scriptures seem to describe it, the spiritual realm, it's more like if you could pull back a curtain or turn on a light. Have you ever turned on a black light and you go, oh, look at my shirt, it's glowing? It's here, it's now. What did Paul say on the Areopagus? He said, God's not far from us. In him we live. In him we move. In him we have our very being. We're taught that we have angels who watch over us, and be careful to entertain strangers, because some have entertained angels unawares. And Jesus said, their angels do always behold the face of my Father who's in heaven. It's like there's a spiritual world that we lose track of. This guy somehow picked up on that, and he understood the reality of the power that was not vested in physical servants, that there was something beyond the world they were in that Jesus had authority in. And we should never become so comfortable that we lose track of that as well. That was a bell, wasn't it? Charlie's shaking his head. You listen close, you can hear it rattle. Well, we don't have much time. But Nain's about 20 miles south of Capernium. And Jesus probably got on a bus, and nice air-conditioned bus, and headed down there. And it's rough country. All over, everywhere we went over there, it was just rocks. And I don't think it's changed from what it was in Jesus' day that much. It's just rocks and hard-traveled country. But as he approaches the city, what's happening? But a dead guy's being brought out. And Jesus tells his mom, don't weep. And he touches the coffin, and the bears come to a halt, and he says, young man, I'm telling you, arise. And he gets up and starts to talk. And what's the result of that among the people? They're afraid. Would that make you afraid? Well, it's hard to know until you're in the situation, but what we're told is they were afraid. Have you ever been around such power that it just kind of scared you? There was no threat to your safety, but it was just so awesome. Thunder, not the basketball team, but God's thunder that shakes everything. When it hits, it's like, whoa, and it's just sound, along with some vibration, but there's a sense of power there. These folks understood, like the centurion understood, there's power. It's unlike anything they had ever seen. And it frightened them. I don't think it frightened them in the sense that they didn't want to be around it. But it was awesome. Awe. What is awe? I think it's a great word, because to say awe, you go, oh. And that's what you do when you see something that's awesome. Your mouth goes, oh, oh. It's just kind of like that. So that's where we'll have to stop tonight. Lord willing, we'll pick up at verse 18 next week. But think about what we've talked about tonight. Keeping in touch with the value of what we're privileged to see in this gospel. Thank you.